I haven't had issues with Puffy. I don't like him like that. Like, I don't like things that he would do and make me uncomfortable.
So we're speaking on Diddy, we're speaking on Puff.
Yeah.
Okay.
The new lawsuit coming with Jay, the part with Jay. I go, oh shoot, like
To us, black excellence,
that had to be there.
We getting tighter, you know what I'm saying? And united we stand, and ain't nothing else.
Black excellence, they're sitting there like, yeah. All right, but Jay definitely not that. That's definitely not. It's just being competitive.
What if everything we thought we knew about hip-hop's power structure was only half the story? What if the biggest names in the culture weren't just artists, but architects? And what if the man who finally pulled the curtain back wasn't a journalist, a prosecutor, or an industry insider desperate for redemption, but 50 Cent? Because 50 Cent's new documentary doesn't whisper, it doesn't hint, it doesn't politely suggest, it shouts. And the reason it has the industry on edge isn't just because it revisits Sean Diddy Combs' downfall, it's because it forces viewers to ask an even more dangerous question. Who else was standing next to him the entire time? For decades, Diddy, Jay-Z, and Beyonce were presented as the untouchable trinity of hip-hop success. Billion-dollar brands, cultural royalty, black excellence embodied. Their images were polished, protected, and celebrated. But now, suddenly, the silence around them feels heavier than the praise ever did, and 50 Cent wants us to notice. Let's start with the timing. This documentary didn't drop randomly. It arrived after Diddy's legal collapse, after the raids, after the lawsuits, after the industry quietly began rewriting its own history. Because when powerful people fall, the first instinct isn't accountability, it's distance, and that distance tells a story. 50 Cent opens the documentary by reframing something fans thought they understood, the so-called rivalries that defined hip-hop's golden era, the beefs, the competition, the ego clashes. According to 50, that narrative was incomplete. This wasn't just about who sold more records or who had better bars. It was about control. Control over radio, control over labels, control over narratives, control over who rose and who vanished. And right at the center of that system sat three men with very different philosophies. On one side, 50 Cent, loud, reckless, impossible to silence. A disruptor who built an empire by weaponizing transparency and daring the industry to respond. On the other, Jay-Z, calm, calculated, and strategic. A businessman who learned early that power doesn't shout, it waits. And between them, Diddy, the connector, the gatekeeper, the man who turned parties into boardrooms and friendships into leverage. According to the documentary, Diddy wasn't just hosting events, he was curating access. If you were inside, doors opened. If you weren't, careers stalled. And the most unsettling claim the film raises isn't that this system existed, it's that it was normalized. Industry insiders interviewed in the documentary describe an environment where the same names dominated charts, award shows, and brand deals year after year. Meanwhile, artists with talent but without protection mysteriously disappeared. It wasn't competition, one source says. It was containment. That line changes everything because containment suggests intention. And that brings us back to Jay-Z. For years, Jay-Z and Diddy publicly presented themselves as independent kings, mutual respect, separate lanes. But 50's documentary challenges that image. It suggests a quiet alliance, not friendship in the emotional sense, but mutual interest. Appear together, validate each other, protect the system. And when the system benefits you, you don't tear it down. Now let's talk about the East Coast suppression theory, one of the most controversial claims in the film. According to former label executives and insiders, the early 2000s saw a shift in how record companies viewed profitability. East Coast artists were demanding ownership, creative control, and long-term investment. Meanwhile, the South offered faster returns, cheaper contracts, and club hits that sold without resistance. The solution? Starve the East Coast, shelve projects, cut promotion, freeze out artists who wouldn't fall in line. And according to the documentary, the people with enough influence to make that happen weren't faceless executives. They were moguls, Jay-Z, Diddy, men who had already secured their positions and had no incentive to let challengers rise. And this is where 50 Cent's story becomes central. Before he exploded globally, 50 was radioactive in New York. Labels wouldn't touch him. Radio stations ignored him. Doors slammed shut. He didn't fail.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, Beyonce, all of them were Diddy's handlers. After watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand.
He was blocked. Forced to leave New York, he took his talent to the West Coast, to Dr. Dre and Eminem, and history took a sharp turn. In the documentary, a former insider puts it bluntly. They didn't want another 50 Cent. They wanted silence. That line hits differently when you realize how many artists never got the chance 50 fought for. Now let's circle back to Diddy and Jay-Z's relationship, because this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Diddy publicly called Jay-Z his brother, his strategist, the first call in a crisis. There's footage of Diddy saying Jay-Z flew thousands of miles just to stand by him. That's not casual, that's alliance. But fast forward to the legal collapse. Suddenly Jay-Z's camp insists there was no real relationship. That pivot matters, because powerful people don't erase relationships unless there's risk. And risk is exactly what this documentary is highlighting. It doesn't accuse Jay-Z of crimes. It doesn't declare guilt. What it does is more dangerous. It asks questions. Why did the same people always benefit? Why did the same people always survive? Why did silence always protect the same names? And then, just when viewers think the film is about history, it drags the conversation into the present, because lawsuits begin resurfacing. Old allegations get revisited, names that once felt untouchable suddenly feel exposed, and 50 Cent doesn't flinch. He narrates calmly, almost patiently, as if to say, "I'm not rushing this. I'm letting you catch up." The documentary ends its first act with a chilling reminder: power doesn't disappear when someone goes to prison. It just changes hands. And if Diddy's fall revealed cracks in the foundation, then the foundation itself might not survive what comes next. Because if one man's empire collapsed under scrutiny, what happens when people start questioning the entire system? And that's where this story is headed. Because in part 2, we're going to talk about the names, the deals, the marriages, and the alliances that turned hip-hop into a corporate fortress, and why Jay-Z and Beyonce sit at the center of it, not as villains, not as heroes, but as beneficiaries. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. If part 1 cracked the surface, part 2 goes deeper into the machinery that made hip-hop's biggest...
That's why you've never heard me say anything negative about it. You see what I'm saying? And also connected to like M, because M's our relationship. My Eminem is Dr. Dre is Eminem's. To Eminem to me is what Dr. Dre is to Eminem.
Yeah.
So to disrespect him in any way is just you out of pocket. You're not even following the chain of command now.
Names untouchable. Because once you stop looking at Jay-Z, Beyonce, and Diddy as individual artists and start viewing them as institutions, everything begins to make sense. This wasn't just music, it was power management. Let's start with the myth that Jay-Z and Diddy were simply competitors. For years, fans were fed the idea that hip-hop thrived on rivalry. East Coast versus West Coast, label versus label, mogul versus mogul. But according to 50 Cent's documentary, that rivalry was mostly for public consumption. Behind closed doors, there was alignment, strategic overlap, shared interests, mutual protection. And the documentary doesn't say this outright, it shows it. Award shows where the same names always won. Radio playlists dominated by the same labels. Brand deals that mysteriously funneled toward the same inner circle. According to former industry executives interviewed in the film, there was an unspoken rule. If you weren't connected, you weren't protected. And protection mattered more than talent. This is where Diddy's role becomes critical. Diddy wasn't just a mogul, he was a connector. Someone who could introduce you to the right executive, the right investor, the right politician, the right brand. His parties weren't social events. They were filtering mechanisms. If you were invited, you mattered. If you weren't, you were invisible. And who was consistently present at those events? Jay-Z, Beyonce, Roc Nation executives, bad boy insiders, corporate sponsors, global power players. The documentary emphasizes this point repeatedly. Access was currency. Now let's talk about the marriage that changed everything. The film introduces what it calls the Beyonce contract theory, not as a conspiracy, but as a cultural observation. Before Beyonce, Jay-Z was respected, but polarizing. Street credibility, legal baggage, industry enemies, a reputation for being cold, strategic, and ruthless. After Beyonce, everything shifted. Suddenly, Jay-Z wasn't just a rapper. He was a symbol, Black excellence, family values, luxury, legacy, awards multiplied, brand partnerships exploded, corporate doors opened. The documentary doesn't claim the marriage was fake. It questions what it represented, because in the entertainment industry, perception is leverage, and Beyonce's spotless image didn't just elevate Jay-Z, it shielded him. Critics interviewed in the film argue that Jay-Z's reputation was effectively rebranded overnight. Past controversies faded, scrutiny softened, the narrative changed. Not because questions disappeared, but because the image became too powerful to challenge, and that image extended beyond music. Let's talk about the NFL deal. When Jay-Z partnered with the NFL after Colin Kaepernick's protest era, the move was framed as progress. A seat at the table, cultural representation, influence from the inside. But the documentary frames it differently. It asks, was this activism or absorption? Because while Jay-Z curated Super Bowl halftime shows and led social justice initiatives, Colin Kaepernick remained unsigned. The league's image improved, the system stayed the same. And critics like Dame Dash appear in archival footage calling the move what they believe it was, a transaction, not transformation. The documentary doesn't tell viewers what to think. It forces them to sit with the contradiction. And that contradiction follows Jay-Z everywhere in the film. Business genius, cultural icon, corporate ally, but also gatekeeper. Now let's talk about lawsuits, not verdicts, not judgments, patterns. The documentary revisits long-standing allegations that never fully disappeared. The paternity case involving Rymir Satterthwaite, claims of legal obstruction, accusations that DNA tests were avoided, court filings that stalled repeatedly. Again, no criminal finding. But the documentary isn't interested in guilt. It's interested in power dynamics. Because when a case persists for over a decade without resolution, the question becomes, who benefits from delay? The film introduces Rymir's guardian, Marilyn Jean, not as a tabloid figure, but as someone exhausted, bankrupt, and emotionally drained by a legal system she claims protected a billionaire. Whether viewers believe her or not, the imbalance is undeniable. And the documentary uses this story as a metaphor for something bigger. When wealth reaches a certain level, accountability becomes optional. Now, zoom out. Jay-Z's empire doesn't just include music. It includes fashion, liquor brands, tech investments, sports management, media influence. And according to the film, that kind of reach doesn't exist without cooperation. Cooperation from executives, from media, from institutions, and yes, from other moguls. Which brings us back to Diddy. The documentary shows clip after clip of Diddy praising Jay-Z as his strategist, the man he trusted, the one who understood how to move when things got complicated. So when Diddy fell, when the raids happened, when the lawsuits piled up, the question wasn't whether people would distance themselves, it was how fast. And Jay-Z's distancing was immediate. Legal teams stepped in. Statements were controlled, narratives shifted. That's not panic, that's preparation. And then came the lawsuits that connected dots no one wanted connected. Civil filings that mentioned both men. Testimonies that placed them in overlapping spaces. Allegations that, even if unproven, were consistent enough to disturb. And through it all, Beyonce said nothing. The documentary doesn't accuse her. It doesn't vilify her. It simply asks, how does someone that powerful stay untouched by proximity? Because proximity matters. It always has. Now let's talk about 50 Cent again, because his role in all of this is intentional. 50 isn't just narrating history. He's challenging hierarchy. He positions himself as the voice of artists who weren't protected, who weren't invited, who were silenced or sidelined. And the contrast the documentary draws is striking. 50 is portrayed as reachable, present, messy, human. Jay-Z is portrayed as distant, insulated, lawyered up, abstract. And the documentary doesn't tell viewers who's right. It asks, which kind of power does hip-hop actually belong to? The people or the corporations? And that question leads us directly into part 3. Because if part 2 is about the structure, part 3 is about the collapse, the lawsuits, the silence, the reckoning, and why 50 Cent is hinting that this story isn't finished. Not even close. Because when one empire falls, it doesn't fall alone. And in part 3, we're going to talk about what happens next. Who might be exposed, why silence is no longer protection, and why hip-hop's royal image may never recover. By the time the documentary reaches its final act, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. This was never just about Sean Diddy Combs. Diddy is the collapse everyone can see, the spectacle, the headlines, the courtroom drama. But what 50 Cent is quietly pointing toward is something much bigger and far more unsettling, a system. And systems don't fall because of one man. They fall when the silence around them stops working. For decades, hip-hop sold the dream of independence, of rebellion, of artists beating the odds and building empires on their own terms. But the documentary asks a question that cuts straight through the mythology. What if the culture wasn't as free as it looked? What if success wasn't just about talent, but about permission? Because when you look at who consistently rose to the top, who stayed there, and who mysteriously disappeared along the way, the pattern starts to look less organic and more engineered. And that's where the story circles back to Jay-Z and Beyonce, not as villains, not as criminals, but as symbols of how power protects itself. Let's talk about silence again. In the wake of Diddy's downfall, dozens of artists rushed to distance themselves. Old photos vanished, statements were released, apologies were made. People rewrote their own histories overnight. But the Carters? They said nothing. No joint statement, no public reflection, no condemnation, no clarification. And in the age of instant PR responses, that absence is deafening. Because silence at this level isn't confusion, it's strategy. The documentary frames this not as guilt, but as calculation. Jay-Z doesn't move emotionally, he moves deliberately, through lawyers, contracts, and controlled messaging. And when lawsuits surfaced that even mentioned his name, whether proven or not, the response was immediate and aggressive. Legal threats, claims of extortion, challenges designed to shut conversations down rather than engage with them. That's not unusual for someone protecting a brand worth billions. What is unusual is how often that strategy has worked. The documentary revisits multiple moments in Jay-Z's career where controversy seemed to stall, fade, or dissolve without resolution. Not because questions were answered, but because they were outlasted. And this is where the film introduces its most unsettling idea. When wealth reaches a certain level, time becomes a weapon. Cases drag on, appeals stall, narratives shift, public attention moves on. Not because the truth is settled, but because people get tired. The Rymir Satterthwaite paternity saga is presented as a case study in this phenomenon. A story that never fully disappears, yet never reaches closure. Courts dismissing claims, jurisdictional loopholes, procedural dead ends. Again, no criminal ruling, no declaration of guilt. But the documentary doesn't ask viewers to judge outcomes. It asks them to examine power imbalance, a billionaire versus a private citizen, endless resources versus exhaustion, lawyers versus time. And when that pattern repeats across different controversies, the question becomes unavoidable. Is the system neutral or selective? Now let's talk about Beyonce, because her role in this narrative is the most complex. The documentary never accuses her of wrongdoing. Instead, it portrays her as something else entirely. A shield. Beyonce's image is one of the cleanest, most carefully protected in entertainment history. Discipline, control, excellence, perfection. And when Jay-Z married Beyonce, the film argues, he didn't just gain a partner, he gained insulation. Together, they became untouchable, the royal couple, the blueprint, the brand. Awards multiplied, corporate partnerships expanded, access widened, and criticism softened. The documentary asks viewers to consider whether this transformation was coincidence or chemistry between power and perception. Because in entertainment, image isn't decoration, it's armor, and that armor extended into politics, sports, and corporate America. The NFL partnership is presented as a turning point, not just for Jay-Z's career, but for how power operates in modern culture. What was framed as progress, representation at the table, is re-examined as absorption into the system. Colin Kaepernick remained unsigned. The league's image improved. Halftime shows became cultural spectacles. The system didn't change, it adapted, and Jay-Z became the bridge. The documentary doesn't call this betrayal, it calls it evolution. From rebel to broker, from artist to intermediary, from voice of the streets to guardian of the gate. And this is where 50 Cent's role becomes crystal clear. 50 isn't attacking success. He's attacking how success is maintained. Throughout the film, he positions himself as the opposite of insulation. Loud, messy, exposed, unfiltered. Someone who never mastered silence and never wanted to. The contrast is intentional. 50 speaks, Jay-Z shields. Diddy collapses, the system waits. And the documentary suggests that Diddy's downfall may not be the end of accountability, but the beginning of scrutiny. Because federal investigations don't stop with one conviction, civil cases don't resolve quietly. Discovery opens doors people forgot existed. Emails resurface, guest lists reappear, financial trails connect dots no one expected. And once that process begins, silence stops being protection. It becomes suspicion. The final act of the documentary is deliberately quiet. No dramatic accusations, no shocking reveals, just questions. Why did so many powerful people know each other so well and claim distance so quickly? Why do the same names keep appearing in stories about control, suppression, and silence? Why does accountability seem to skip certain levels of wealth? And perhaps the most dangerous question of all, if hip-hop was built as a voice for the voiceless, what happens when that voice becomes corporate? The film ends on a warning rather than a conclusion. Diddy wasn't the end. He was the exposure. And exposure doesn't care about legacy. It doesn't respect brands. It doesn't negotiate with silence. It waits. 50 Cent's final message is simple but chilling. The truth doesn't expire, it just waits for the right moment. And right now, that moment feels closer than ever. Because when systems start cracking, they don't break all at once. They fracture, quietly, slowly, publicly. So the question isn't whether more stories will surface, it's who will still be standing when they do. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you think this documentary is really setting up. And tell us whether silence is a sign of innocence or a sign of power. And if you want more deep dives, hidden connections, and celebrity stories they don't want you questioning, like this video, share it and subscribe to I Love Gossip. Because over here, we don't just follow the headlines, we follow what's hiding behind them. A shield. Beyonce's image is one of the cleanest, most carefully protected in entertainment history. Discipline, control, excellence, perfection. And when Jay-Z married Beyonce, the film argues, he didn't just gain a partner, he gained insulation. Together, they became untouchable, the royal couple, the blueprint, the brand. Awards multiplied, corporate partnerships expanded, access widened, and criticism softened. The documentary asks viewers to consider whether this transformation was coincidence or chemistry between power and perception. Because in entertainment, image isn't decoration, it's armor, and that armor extended into politics, sports, and corporate America. The NFL partnership is presented as a turning point, not just for Jay-Z's career, but for how power operates in modern culture. What was framed as progress, representation at the table, is re-examined as absorption into the system. Colin Kaepernick remained unsigned. The league's image improved. Halftime shows became cultural spectacles. The system didn't change, it adapted, and Jay-Z became the bridge. The documentary doesn't call this betrayal, it calls it evolution. From rebel to broker, from artist to intermediary, from voice of the streets to guardian of the gate. And this is where 50 Cent's role becomes crystal clear. 50 isn't attacking success, he's attacking how success is maintained. Throughout the film, he positions himself as the opposite of insulation: loud, messy, exposed, unfiltered. Someone who never mastered silence and never wanted to. The contrast is intentional. 50 speaks, Jay-Z shields. Diddy collapses, the system waits. And the documentary suggests that Diddy's downfall may not be the end of accountability, but the beginning of scrutiny. Because federal investigations don't stop with one conviction, civil cases don't resolve quietly. Discovery opens doors people forgot existed. Emails resurface. Guest lists reappear. Financial trails connect dots no one expected. And once that process begins, silence stops being protection. It becomes suspicion. The final act of the documentary is deliberately quiet. No dramatic accusations, no shocking reveals, just questions. Why did so many powerful people know each other so well and claim distance so quickly? Why do the same names keep appearing in stories about control, suppression, and silence? Why does accountability seem to skip certain levels of wealth? And perhaps the most dangerous question of all, if hip-hop was built as a voice for the voiceless, what happens when that voice becomes corporate? The film ends on a warning rather than a conclusion. Diddy wasn't the end. He was the exposure. And exposure doesn't care about legacy. It doesn't respect brands. It doesn't negotiate with silence. It waits. 50 Cent's final message is simple but chilling. The truth doesn't expire. It just waits for the right moment. And right now, that moment feels closer than ever. Because when systems start cracking, they don't break all at once. They fracture, quietly, slowly, publicly. So the question isn't whether more stories will surface. It's who will still be standing when they do. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you think this documentary is really setting up. And tell us whether silence is a sign of innocence or a sign of power. And if you want more deep dives, hidden connections, and celebrity stories they don't want you questioning, like this video, share it and subscribe to I Love Gossip. Because over here, we don't just follow the headlines, we follow what's hiding behind them.